Great, thanks a lot for that, Greg. Welcome everybody to today's webinar. I'm just going to give you quite a brief overview of your duty of care to animals under the Animal Care and Protection Act. So I'll kick off. Okay, so duty of care for animals in your charge. I'll go through what appropriate care is as the first section. So appropriate care, providing food and water, we might think that's a fairly obvious thing to provide, but it does cover a number of different scenarios. So providing the most appropriate food for the species of animals that are in your care. It also covers supplementary feeding. At the moment, we're just about to come into winter and we might have a big body of grass now from the rain we did receive a few months ago, but it's starting to hay off. So you do need to consider supplementary feeding your animals if required, what type of supplementary feeding they require to maintain them in an adequate body condition. And also water, providing clean, fresh drinking water, making sure if your animals are watering off dams, making sure that the dam is safe for that animal, they're not bogging in that dam when they're getting water, they've got sufficient water in that dam that it is clean and it's not tepid water that's only about 10 centimetres deep. So there is quite a bit involved in this providing the food and water than just the overall basics there. Providing appropriate living conditions. So this again depends on the species of your animal, what climate you're in, whether it's a hot and cold climate, the type of care the different species require, behaviours of those animals. So for instance, providing appropriate shade, providing enough room for those animals to move around. Can they lie down and fully stretch out? Can they move around without any obstacles around them? And understanding an animal's normal behavioural patterns. So this will vary from species to species. For example, are they herd animals? Do they require a mate with them? Are they grazing animals? Will they be living in a pen? What kind of stimuli do they need? What kind of exercise do they need if you've got dogs, etc. So you really need to understand the type of species, normal behavioural patterns, so you can adequately look after those animals and provide your duty of care. And if you don't know much about the species of animals that you are thinking of getting, you certainly need to research that before you obtain those animals so you have an understanding of that. Treating disease and injury. So once again, understanding the species of the animal and the most common diseases for those species and putting together a vaccination program for those animals. Treating injury. If you're unable to treat the injury yourself, if it's a severe injury, obtaining veterinary advice or assessment for that animal. Sometimes people can't afford to get a vet out to treat an animal. If the animal is suffering, like undue stress and suffering, it is inappropriate to leave that animal without being treated because you cannot afford the vet, and you may have to consider euthanizing that animal. And handling the animal appropriately. So what is the most appropriate way to handle that species of animal? Have you got the correct handling facilities for the type of animals that you've got? Have you got the correct equipment to handle those animals, to restrain them if they need treatment, etc.? So all of these things really need to be looked at quite carefully before you obtain animals to make sure that you have the best environment and knowledge to be able to provide a duty of care to them. So what is appropriate care? There's a number of things that you need to consider to provide appropriate care to your animals to meet your duty of care requirements. So the type of animal, once again, the species of the animal, the age, which is quite important. Going back to supplementary feeding in winter, you might have a small herd of cattle and you might have an older cow there and you're supplementary feeding and she's getting knocked around. She's not getting that supplement, so she's starting to lose condition. You need to be assessing that, maybe remove that cow from the herd with a mate and feed her separately so you can maintain her body condition. Also the environment the animal's living in, is it a cold environment, a hot environment, have they got sufficient shade or shelter from extreme weather, and just the general circumstances. So when I talk about circumstances, this goes into what is reasonably expected to be undertaken to provide the care given the circumstances as well. So that could be, for instance, we've had the bushfires and we've had the floods. So there's circumstances that will actually change the way that you care for your animals. If you've got, say, some horses or cattle in a paddock and you've got a fire coming through, in those extreme circumstances, to ensure the welfare of those animals, you may have to cut the fence so the animal can actually get out away from the danger. In a normal circumstance, you certainly wouldn't do that. So the circumstances will change depending on various events, which do include extreme weather events. And weather and climate, we've seen the horrible drought that we've been through, and we're certainly not over it yet, but it is no excuse to let an animal die in the paddock because you've run out of feed or you've run out of water. If you've got to the point where your animals cannot be moved because they're too poor, so they're unfit to load, the most humane thing you can do is euthanize those animals and not let them die of food and lack of feed, starvation, or lack of water. And Jeff Neath, the next presenter, will be going into more about euthanasia in regards to that. So who's a person in charge? It's not just the owner of the animal. It's also the person that has custody of the animal or the animal's in your care, and also a person that has financial interest in the animal or is employing someone to take care of that animal. So for example, if a friend of yours went away for a couple of weeks and said, oh, look, can you feed my dog for me? It needs to be fed every day, check its water, I'll be back in 2 weeks. You've agreed to do that. You fail to do that, the animal dies, then you're the person in charge of that animal, even if you don't own it, because you've agreed to take care of that animal and look after it. So more about some examples of who might have a duty of care to animals. It does cover a range of areas, industries, people. And I'll give you an example in regards to cattle, because it's probably the most easiest one to explain. You're sending your cattle to the sale yards to sell them. You're mustering those cattle in, you're handling them in the yards, getting ready to transport. You've got a duty of care for those animals because you either own them or they're in your custody, you're handling them. Once those animals get on the truck, then that transport driver has a duty of care for those animals. If he doesn't own the truck, also the owner of the truck or the company that owns that truck also has a duty of care for those animals. When those animals arrive at the sale yards, once they're unloaded, the sale yard staff have a duty of care for those animals. So you can see in that scenario, the duty of care is actually transferring from person to person as those animals are leaving your property on the truck and then getting off the truck. So the duty of care does cover a wide range of scenarios and people in regards to animals and movement of animals as well. Another example is there's large pastoral companies in Australia, particularly here in Queensland. So those companies have a duty of care. Their managers for the properties that they own have a duty of care, and all their staff under them that are working on those properties handling the livestock have a duty of care. So there's a number of people involved in the duty of care for those animals. So transportation of livestock. So this is extremely important to understand this, and I'll go through when animals are unfit to load. But firstly, I'll just mention there is a fit to load guide, which is a nice little pocket-sized book that if anybody's interested at the end of the webinar, they can just contact Greg by the chat section, or there could be another way that Greg might be able to say to do it. And if you want that little pocket guide, we can post that out for you. It's certainly very handy to have when you're in the yards and you're loading your livestock to make sure they're fit to load. Okay, so the first one, unable to weight bear on all legs. Now that should be quite obvious, and you need to be assessing this when you're bringing your livestock into the yards, so when you're mustering them, when you're handling them in the yards, and also even when you're loading them on the truck, to make sure that none of these factors apply to them. If they do, they are not fit to load. So severely emaciated, so very, very poor condition, they're not fit to load. And Jeff Neath will go through this in his talk and give you some examples of condition scoring animals, so you've got a bit of an idea of that. Severely visibly dehydrated, it should be quite obvious, but another way you can test it is by pinching the skin of the animal. The quicker that the skin goes back to normal, the less dehydrated they are. Animals that are very dehydrated, when you pinch their skin, the skin will stay puckered up, and that's a very good sign of how dehydrated they are if you do have some concerns. So if they're showing visible signs of injury or distress, so if you're bringing animals in and they may have injured themselves in the yards or cut their legs in fences, they're not fit to load if they're suffering from a severe injury or they're extremely distressed. And suffering from a condition that's likely to increase pain and distress. So this is very important. A couple of examples of this is if you had a beast with an ingrown horn, and it's going to doesn't matter if it's going to the meat mercs or wherever it is, that animal is not fit to load because it's suffering from a condition that's likely to increase pain and distress. Because once that animal's on that truck, it could be getting knocked around by other cattle, it could be getting pushed against the side of the truck. That horn is continually pushing into its head, so it is unfit to load. Another example, and I'm sort of just using cattle here, but a cow that's prolapsed, even though she might be going to the meat works, she is unfit to load because she's got a condition that will increase pain and suffering while she's on that truck, and blind in both eyes. So we've got under there, unless under the advice of a veterinary surgeon. So what we're talking about there is some circumstances where for the welfare of the animal or other scenarios, that animal really needs to be transported. You can ask your vet to come out and assess that animal to give permission for it to move. Now, that's completely up to the vet who's assessing that animal, whether they give permission for it to move, and it depends on a number of different circumstances. Okay, so what does transporting mean? It involves a lot of considerations that we often don't think of. So it's mustering your livestock, holding your livestock before loading. It's selecting your livestock for loading, which we've just gone over, fit to transport, fit to load. It's loading your livestock onto the truck or whatever transport container they're going onto. It's also when livestock are being held on a vehicle while it's stationary during transport. And it also involves unloading animals as well. So I'll just go through that in a little bit more detail. So mustering, holding and handling your livestock. So you need to ensure if your livestock are getting transported and you're mustering them in to move them, make sure they have sufficient time just to settle down the yards and cool down. They're not just getting run into the yards and run straight onto the truck, and they're being assessed appropriately to make sure they're fit to load. Have you got a suitable holding facility for those animals while they're waiting to be loaded? Is it free of protrusions? Have they got enough traction on the floor surface to not be slipping over and injuring themselves before they're loading? And also appropriate handling of livestock, so not jiggering them every time they go up the race to try and get them on the truck, which I'm sure we've seen happen quite a few times before, but that's not appropriate handling of livestock. Suitability of the handling facilities, once again, making sure the handling facilities are suitable for the species of animals that you've got. They're also, once again, free of protrusions. The animals haven't got risk of slipping over and injuring themselves. They've got enough clearance. For instance, you might have some big bulls coming in, and you've got a race there with a bit of a shed roof over the top of it, and those bulls are knocking themselves every time they go under. That it's not a particularly good suitable handling facilities for those class of animals. Are they fit to load, which we've just went over, and as I said, you need to assess that every single time you're loading your animals. The class of livestock, which is very important. So what class of livestock is it? So for example, I'll go to cattle again. Are you transporting weaners? Are you transporting mature age bulls? You certainly wouldn't be mixing weaners with bulls in the same compartment because the weaners have got a chance of getting injured, trampled on. You wouldn't be mixing horned animals with unhorned animals on the truck because they could get injured as well. Are they lactating animals? Are they heavily pregnant animals? All that needs to be considered. And the suitability of the transport container. So is it suitable for the species of livestock that you're transporting? Your loading density, which we'll get into just down below, that's also extremely important. A good thing to get into a habit of if you're getting someone to transport your livestock for you is when that vehicle turns up, just spend 5 minutes having a quick walk around it to make sure that it's in quite good repair, that the floor of it isn't starting to fall through where animals could get injured. Is it reasonably clean? Because if it's full of feces and urine, those animals will have trouble getting traction and could slip over and injure themselves. The loading density. So the loading density will depend on the species and the class of the livestock, and it'll vary between those. And once again, as I said, you just need to be very careful of the loading density, particularly in regards to class of livestock. Even if they're going to the sale yards 10 kilometres down the road, don't be tempted to load those animals heavier than what they should, because they could get smothered and be dead when they get there. So times off feed and water. So that will vary again depending on species and class of animals. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So for bobby calves, and when we're talking about bobby calves, so calves that are less than 5 days of age, they have certain requirements for when they're being transported. They cannot be transported for more than 6 hours. And there's also a number of other requirements in regards to those. For instance, they have to be fed a liquid feed within 6 hours of being transported. They have to have thick bedding in the truck, etc. There's also different requirements around lactating and pregnant animals. For example, cattle that are heavily pregnant, so more than about 37 weeks, their maximum journey time is only 4 hours, and they have to have a 24-hour minimum spell. In regards to cattle that aren't lactating and mature age cattle, they can be transported up to 48 hours. So it certainly does vary between whether the age of the animal, the species, whether they're lactating or whether they're heavily pregnant, and all that needs to be taken into consideration before those animals are moved. So journey time spelling, and I've just touched on that in regards to journey time. If your animals are travelling for a lengthy period of time, you need to organise with the truck driver and suitable facilities. If those animals are required to be spelled, you need to have that arranged, where they're getting spelled, have adequate feed and water at those spelling facilities. And also it's good to have a contact for the person or the facility where they actually is the end of their journey, so you can make sure those cattle have arrived all right. Last one there, extreme weather conditions, which can cause heat and cold stress. So for instance, if you've got animals that are coming up from the southern states and they're coming up here, and particularly around southeast Queensland where it can get quite hot and extremely humid, and those animals are coming from a cold environment, they can actually die from heat stress because it's such a shock to their body. The same happens with cold stress, particularly if you've got extreme weather events like a cyclone, etc. And those animals are on a truck for a long period of time. In the rain, in the wind, they can actually suffer from cold stress. So once again, it's about planning ahead and making sure that your animals are travelling in the best possible conditions. And that's the end of my talk. So even though it was only a very brief overview, if you require any other information, you can contact your local biosecurity inspector. If you don't know who your local biosecurity inspector is, you can contact the customer service centre and they can put you in touch with them or with the most relevant person who can provide the information for you.